Before we go into the executive order that would captivate conspiracy theorists for decades, we need to understand what was happening in America's monetary system during the early 1960s. If you have taken any economics class, you know that the way a government manages its currency says a lot about its priorities. Kennedy's administration found itself in a peculiar situation that would force a decision that, to this day, sparks intense debate among historians, economists, and truth-seekers alike. During the 1950s and into the early 1960s, something was happening in the markets that most Americans never noticed. Silver, the shiny metal that had been used in American coins for generations, was suddenly in demand for something other than just looking pretty on a nickel or dime. Industry needed it. Photographers needed it. Manufacturers across the country were hungry for silver because it had unique properties that made it invaluable in their processes. As industrial demand climbed higher and higher, the market price of silver began to rise above what the United States government had set as its official price. This created a problem that would ripple through the Treasury Department. The government had a huge stockpile of silver sitting in its vaults, stacked in reserves that had been accumulated for decades. But here is where it gets tricky. When the market price rises above the official government price, arbitrage happens. People and businesses would buy silver from the government at the fixed lower price and turn around and sell it on the open market at the higher price. Free money, essentially. The Treasury's excess silver reserves began to drain at an alarming rate, declining by over 80% in a single year during 1961 alone. Something had to give, and Kennedy knew it. In November 1961, Kennedy took his first action on this growing silver crisis. He ordered the Treasury Department to halt all sales of silver. It sounds simple enough, but this was actually a significant decision. The government was saying, "No more sales at this price. We are stopping the bleeding." Kennedy understood that if something did not change, the nation's silver supply would be completely drained, leaving nothing for industry and nothing for the coinage needs of the American people. But stopping the sales was only the first part of the equation. Kennedy recognized that silver had become less useful as a form of money and more essential as an industrial material. This was not some radical free market idea. It was practical economics. In his 1963 economic report to Congress, Kennedy was remarkably direct about his thinking. He stated that silver serves no useful monetary function except for its use in coins, and he was pushing hard for Congress to act. He wanted to move the country toward a system where the Treasury could control the distribution of currency more directly, without the constraints of trying to maintain silver as a monetary standard. What is fascinating here is that Kennedy was not trying to destroy the Federal Reserve. He was actually trying to give the government more flexibility in managing its currency supply. He called for the repeal of laws that forced the Treasury to back up its silver certificates with physical silver. He wanted the Federal Reserve to be authorized to issue $1 and $2 bills in smaller denominations. The goal was straightforward. Get the silver out of circulation so it could be used for industry and coinage, while streamlining the monetary system to meet modern economic needs. Kennedy did not just sit around hoping Congress would figure things out. He pushed for action, and Congress responded. In early 1963, the House of Representatives took up the President's request, and on April 10th of that year, H.R. 5389 was passed by a vote of 251 to 122. The Senate followed suit, and the bill moved through the legislative process with surprising speed and bipartisan support. The Senate passed the bill on May 23rd with a 68-10 vote. This legislation, which became Public Law 88-36, did exactly what Kennedy had asked for. It repealed the Silver Purchase Act of 1934, which had required the Treasury to buy and support the price of silver for decades. It eliminated a punitive 50% tax on silver transfers. And here is the key part. It authorized the Federal Reserve to issue lower denomination currency. With this act, the government was preparing to transition away from silver-backed certificates and toward a more flexible monetary system based on Federal Reserve notes. But there was a legal complication that nobody initially planned for. When Congress repealed those old silver laws, it inadvertently removed the direct authority that the president possessed to issue silver certificates. The system had been built on the assumption that someone would need that authority during the transition period. So Kennedy had to delegate his power to the Secretary of the Treasury to make sure the process could continue smoothly. This brings us to the moment that would become legend. On June 4th, 1963, the same day Kennedy signed Public Law 88-36 into law, he also signed Executive Order 1-1110. This executive order amended Executive Order 10-289 by delegating to the Secretary of the Treasury the President's authority to issue silver certificates under the Thomas Amendment of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, as amended by the Gold Reserve Act. If you are reading the technical language and thinking, "That sounds boring," you are partly right. But the implications were anything but boring. The executive order stated that the Treasury had the power to issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver, or standard silver dollars in the Treasury. What this meant in practical terms was that for every ounce of silver sitting in the United States Treasury's vault, the government could now issue currency backed by that silver without going through the Federal Reserve. The Secretary of the Treasury could print certificates that were directly backed by precious metal. According to various sources, more than $4 billion in United States notes were brought into circulation in $2 and $5 denominations. These became known informally as Kennedy bills because they were issued under Kennedy's authority. The Treasury was also printing $10 and $20 denominations, though these were never distributed before events intervened. The federal government had, through this executive order, created a new monetary instrument that operated outside the traditional Federal Reserve framework. Now, here is where the story takes a turn toward the dramatic, and where we need to be very careful about separating fact from interpretation. Some theorists saw Executive Order 1-1110 as Kennedy's attempt to strike a blow against the Federal Reserve itself. The reasoning went like this. If the government could issue its own currency backed by silver, it would not need to borrow from the Federal Reserve and pay interest on that money. Over time, replacing Federal Reserve notes with silver-backed certificates could theoretically give the government more control over its money supply and reduce the national debt's growth. Authors like Jim Marrs proposed in his book Crossfire that Kennedy was attempting to transfer monetary power from the Federal Reserve to the Treasury Department. If this theory were true, it would mean Kennedy was challenging one of the most powerful financial institutions in America. The narrative captured people's imagination. A young president taking on the banking establishment, trying to restore constitutional control of the money supply to the people's elected representatives rather than leaving it in the hands of a supposedly private institution. The theory intensified when Kennedy was assassinated just 5 months later on November 22, 1963. Suddenly, conspiracy theorists had a dark narrative to work with. A president who challenged the Federal Reserve and then died under mysterious circumstances. The fact that Kennedy had issued this order became a piece of what many believed was a much larger puzzle, with some suggesting that powerful financial interests had decided Kennedy was too much of a threat to tolerate. But here's what makes this story interesting to explore. Because the actual historical record doesn't quite match the dramatic narrative that's become popular. Kennedy explicitly favored Federal Reserve notes as the nation's currency and worked to demonetize silver. His own public statements and actions contradict the idea that he was trying to undermine the Federal Reserve. In fact, according to researchers who examined Kennedy's actual economic policies and statements, there is no evidence that Kennedy was planning to end the Federal Reserve. More than 30 years after his death, the Congressional Research Service examined this very question and concluded that Executive Order 11110 did not limit the Federal Reserve's power. Kennedy was not anti-Fed at all. His campaign speeches in 1960 had actually emphasized his commitment to keeping the Federal Reserve independent from political pressure. He said publicly that he did not advocate any changes to the constitution of the Federal Reserve System. What Kennedy actually wanted was something much more pragmatic and much less revolutionary. Kennedy's intention was not to challenge the Federal Reserve by issuing a competing currency, but rather to facilitate a transition from silver-backed certificates to Federal Reserve notes for practical economic reasons. The silver was needed for industry. The currency system needed to be modernized. Executive Order 11110 was an administrative tool to make that transition work smoothly, nothing more. Think about it this way. When you're renovating your house and the old plumbing needs to be replaced with new plumbing, you don't tear out all the old pipes at once. You run the new system alongside the old system for a period of time, making sure everything transitions smoothly. That's essentially what Kennedy was doing with the monetary system. The silver certificates and the new Federal Reserve structure could coexist for a transition period, and then the old system would gradually fade away. When Kennedy died, the nation was in shock, but the machinery of government continued. President Lyndon B. Johnson took office, and here's where things get murky, because Johnson never reversed Executive Order 11110. The order remained on the books as a valid, active executive order. Yet Johnson also never implemented it in any meaningful way. In 1964, Secretary of the Treasury C. Douglas Dillon stopped exchanging silver certificates for silver dollars. The transition away from silver-backed currency continued, but it happened through standard policy decisions rather than through any aggressive use of Kennedy's executive order. By 1968, silver redemption had ended entirely. The silver sitting in the Treasury's vaults was freed up for industrial use, exactly as Kennedy had wanted. The government's silver reserves were actually managed and utilized for manufacturing and strategic purposes. But the path to get there was through Federal Reserve notes, not through an expansion of Treasury-issued silver certificates. For decades, Executive Order 11110 remained dormant, signed but unused. It was technically still valid law, but it had no practical effect. No subsequent president used it. No Treasury Secretary invoked it. The machinery Kennedy had created simply sat idle. Meanwhile, the national debt grew to astronomical levels, and the debate about who should control the money supply continued to simmer in various political circles. For nearly a quarter century, Executive Order 11110 existed in a kind of legal limbo. That ended during Ronald Reagan's presidency. On September 9, 1987, as part of a general cleanup of executive orders, President Ronald Reagan issued Executive Order 12608, which removed the text that had been added to EO 10289 by EO 11110. Reagan's order was routine administrative housekeeping, cleaning up old executive orders that were no longer in use or whose authority had been superseded. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation with Kennedy's legacy. It was just bureaucratic maintenance. But by that point, the legislative authority underpinning the order had already been dismantled. In 1982, Congress eliminated the remaining legal foundation behind Executive Order 11110 with the passing of Public Law 97-258. So Reagan's 1987 revocation was technically cleaning up legal language that had no force anyway. The whole apparatus that Kennedy had set up in 1963 had been methodical. So, we're left with a fascinating historical question. If Executive Order 11110 wasn't actually revolutionary, if Kennedy wasn't secretly trying to overthrow the Federal Reserve, if the order was just an administrative tool for a practical economic transition, why has it captivated people's imaginations for 60 years? Part of the answer is that it touches on something people genuinely care about: who controls the money supply and who benefits from that control. The Federal Reserve's role in the economy, how our currency is created, and whether politicians or bankers have more power in determining monetary policy are legitimately important questions. Kennedy's order became a symbol for something that people wish had happened, even if the historical evidence suggests it wasn't actually what was happening. The other part of the answer is that Kennedy's assassination created a narrative void. When a president dies suddenly, people naturally wonder about causation and motive. The fact that Kennedy had recently issued an executive order that could theoretically challenge the Federal Reserve's power seemed significant, even though it probably wasn't. The coincidence was too perfect, the implications too dramatic. In the absence of complete information, people's imaginations filled in the gaps, creating a story that was more compelling than the mundane reality of currency transition and silver policy management. What's genuinely valuable about understanding Executive Order 11110 isn't the conspiracy narrative. It's the lesson about how government, money, and policy actually work. Kennedy faced a real problem. The nation's silver reserves were being depleted by market forces. He had to figure out how to manage that transition while protecting both industrial needs and monetary stability. He worked through the legislative process, got Congress to vote on the issue, won bipartisan support, and then used an executive order to implement policy in an orderly fashion. It's a reminder that most of what government does is far less dramatic than movies and conspiracy theories suggest. Most decisions are made by committees, with input from multiple agencies, debated in Congress, and implemented gradually through normal bureaucratic processes. Kennedy didn't take some bold unilateral action against the Federal Reserve. He managed a currency system transition that needed to happen for practical economic reasons. The silver certificates eventually disappeared from circulation. The dollar became less tied to precious metals. The Federal Reserve's role evolved, especially after President Nixon delinked the dollar from gold in the early 1970s. These changes happened not because of secret battles between presidents and bankers, but because the global economy was changing and monetary systems had to adapt. The true mystery about Executive Order 11110 might not be about Kennedy's intentions or about any conspiracy. It might be something simpler. What if Kennedy had lived, won re-election in 1964, and served a full 2 terms? Would he have used that executive order more aggressively? Would he have pushed harder against the Federal Reserve in a second term, when he wouldn't have to worry about re-election? Or would he have continued on the practical, moderate course that characterized his first term? We'll never know. What we can know is that Kennedy issued an order that gave the Treasury the authority to create money backed by silver, that this order remained on the books for more than 2 decades after his death unused, and that it was only formally revoked as part of routine administrative cleaning. The rest, the grand theories about overthrows and conspiracies, are speculation built on what we wish had happened rather than what the evidence suggests actually did. But that's the fascinating thing about history. Sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones where the dramatic narrative we've created turns out to be more elaborate than the simple truth. And that's not a bug, it's actually a feature. It reminds us to look closely at what really happened, to distinguish between what we know and what we assume, and to appreciate that the actual workings of government, while sometimes frustrating and often complex, are usually far more straightforward than we imagine them to be.